some work on the impact of colonialism on Indian medical education. And this is certainly a area of interest which we are also developing. I think in this whole region, people are interested in this. And it's indeed my pleasure and privilege now to request Anshu to give a presentation. Over to you, Anshu.
Good evening, everybody. At the outset, let me thank Dr. Saroj and the Global Network for Health Humanities for inviting me to conduct this webinar. I am a pathologist, but I'm also a medical educator, and I work at the Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Medical Sciences, which is in Sevagram, a small village in central India, which has its roots embedded in history. Sevagram was Mahatma Gandhi's Karma Bhumi, and I will come back to why that matters. The title of my session today is The Colonial DNA of Medical Education in South Asia, What We Inherited and What We Must Reimagine. I want to spend a moment here on the word DNA. DNA, and that's the pathologist in me coming out. So DNA replicates and it expresses itself even when you are not aware you are carrying it. You can inherit a gene without ever choosing it, and some genes cause harm, not because they are inherently bad, but because the environment they now operate in is completely different from the one in which they first appeared. That is the argument I want to make today. Not blame, not nostalgia, a careful, honest look at what we carry and what we might choose to express differently. Before I proceed to the history of colonization, um, I want to ask you something. Think back to when you were trained. I'm not talking about what you were taught, but how the environment felt. Did you train in an environment where hierarchy was unquestioned, where silence was rewarded, where keeping quiet felt safer than expressing your views, where memorization of facts mattered more than reflection, where your fluency in English was taken as a sign of competence, where humiliation was normalized as a form of teaching. Just keep your answers in mind. You don't need to share them yet. Keep them with you because in the next hour, we are going to find out exactly where these thoughts came from. And what if these were not accidental, but if they were historically inherited? That is the question at the center of this session. Not are these bad things? We probably agree that they are bad, but where did they come from? Because you cannot change what you cannot name, and you cannot name what you have convinced yourself is simply the way things are. I want to tell you first why I chose this topic. Around 12 years ago, Dr. Avinash Supe asked me to collaborate with him to write an invited book chapter on the evolution of medical education in India. I found it intriguing, and since I had never written an article on history, I began reading up all that I could find. I spent a lot of energy and money buying rare books on colonial history, and we came up with a great chapter. But for some reason, the editor of the book never managed to find a publisher, and our chapter went into hibernation. And so we decided to turn this chapter into a journal article, although it broke my heart to chop off a lot of detail. In 2016, it was accepted in the Journal of Postgraduate Medicine. But the process of writing the chapter was something very different. The more I read, the more I felt that I was not writing about the past. I was writing about our present, about our worldview of modern medicine, and about how we behave with patients, about how we teach our students. And that is where I thought of this topic. Everything that I say today is rooted in that research and in the 25 years of learning, teaching, and practice that I have been through. Before I tell you what imperialism built, I want to spend a few minutes on what we already had. Because the standard colonial narrative begins with the arrival of our colonizers. And it is like before the British came, there was darkness. That's a false narrative. And sadly, we have internalized it. Have a look at these two giants, Maharshi Charak. Uh, the Charak Samhita that he wrote describes over 340 plant-based medicines, a sophisticated understanding of digestion, metabolism, and constitution, and a theory of disease that encompasses mind, body, and environment. Maharshi Sushruta, the Sushruta Samhita, describes 120 surgical instruments and over 300 surgical procedures. Among them, hold your breath, is rhinoplasty, reconstructive surgery of the nose, described in precise anatomical detail with post-operative care instructions over 1,000 years before European medicine had a word for it. These were not folk remedies, they were systematic, documented, practiced bodies of knowledge accumulated over centuries, taught in institutions, and peer reviewed in the sense that it actually matters. That is, they were tested against outcomes in living patients. Coming to these two great centers of learning, Nalanda and Takshashila were not random institutes. They were sophisticated residential universities with stringent selection processes where foreign students arrived to seek admission. Nalanda, 5th century BC, at its height, had 10,000 students, 2,000 teachers. Its library contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Medicine was taught here alongside philosophy, logic, mathematics, and grammar. Chinese scholars traveled here to study. Takshashila, even older, 5th century BC. Panini, who gave us the foundational grammar of Sanskrit, studied here. Chanakya, who wrote the Arthashastra, the text of economics, taught here. I mention this because one of the quietest legacies of colonialism is the belief that the university, the idea of a place dedicated to organized knowledge, was a Western gift to India. It was not. Nalanda was a great university 6 centuries before Oxford. Now, coming to the local ecosystem, before the East India Company arrived, Ayurvedic Vaidyas and Unani Hakims were collaborating. They borrowed from each other. They absorbed knowledge from Arab and Chinese travelers through centuries of trade. There is hardly any account of animosity between the practitioners of these different systems. The medical landscape of South Asia was pluralistic to its core until the Raj arrived. Medical knowledge was shared, not siloed. Practitioners were embedded in their communities. Disease was understood not simply as a biological event, but in relation to the patient's constitution, the environment, and the relationship with the healer. That is not a primitive understanding of medicine. That is precisely what 21st century health humanities is now asking us to return to. So, this was our tradition with 2,000 years of surgery, medicine, and anatomy. What happened to it? Hold on to the question. The answer is not what you might expect. Let us now go into the history of colonial medicine. And I promise this is not a history lesson, it is an explanation of the present. Most people think that the arrival of Western medicine in India is a British story, but actually it begins much earlier with the Portuguese. In 1510, when Alfonso de Albuquerque captured Goa, one of the first things the Portuguese administration did was build a hospital, the Royal College of the Holy Spirit. Medicine and governance traveled together. They always do. And then there is Garcia de Horta, a Portuguese physician who came to Goa in the 1830s and spent decades there interacting with the Hakims in the Sultan's Darbar in Ahmednagar. He studied Indian botanical plant medicine from the Ayurvedic Vaidyas. And with his Portuguese administrator, he traveled to tree plantations in Jaffna to learn about medicinal plants, especially plants which can be curative in snake bites. His 1563 work, Colloquies dos Simples y Drogas de India, loosely translated to mean elementary discussions on the drugs and medicines of India, documented the medicinal plants of the subcontinent with extraordinary care and respect. He recognized the value of the botanical knowledge in the Indian subcontinent. He did not dismiss it. However, that recognition would not survive into the next century of colonial medicine. The encounter between Western and Indian medicine, which began with curiosity, sadly, eventually turned into contempt. In 1600, the East India Company's first fleet arrived, and amongst its personnel were medical officers. And lest you forget, those medical officers were there to provide medical relief to troops and employees. They were not there for the Indians. In 1785, medical departments had been established in Bengal Presidency, Madras Presidency, and Bombay Presidency. The medical infrastructure being built was a military administrative infrastructure. However, appointing European doctors had large financial implications. And this prompted the British government to look towards establishing a system of local medical education in India to recruit the local people. So the truth is that medical education in India was invented as a cost cutting exercise. And I think we've been too polite about it for too long. It was not philanthropy. It was not a vision for Indian health. It was, to put it simply, a budget constraint. The British needed local doctors as cheap labor for a cost cutting exercise. That is the foundation on which every medical college in the subcontinent was built. Medicine in the colonial context was never simply about healing. It was simply a vector for imperial expansion. The colonizers needed doctors, they needed assistants, compounders for their troops. They needed them for their families when they traveled for economic reasons. And when confronted with the huge epidemics of cholera and plague, they realized that untrained volunteers would not suffice. Quarantine and segregation of populations was very important because they were impediments in trade and commerce. They also needed data for surveillance of the populations. So medicine, like the famous railways, was introduced simply as an instrument for governance. Now, this is an interesting story. Um, in 1822, something very fascinating happened. The native medical institution was established in Calcutta. And listen to what it looked like, because it's very different from what came after. 20 students were recruited. John Tyler, an Orientalist, was appointed as the first superintendent. The students were imparted training in the vernacular medium. European textbooks were actively translated into the local languages. And most crucially, Western and indigenous medicine were taught side by side. The students from the Western Medical School were taken to learn Unani medicine at the Calcutta Madrasa. They were taken for classes on Ayurvedic medicine at the Sanskrit College. So simultaneously, we had Western and indigenous medicine, and both were equally legitimate. This was briefly a fascinating pluralistic medical education, one that held two knowledge systems in respectful dialogue. And this lasted 13 years. But everything was about to change in 1835. 1835. In February that year, Thomas Macaulay composed his minute on education. And he recommended that the government withhold all grants from institutions conferring instruction in the native languages. The aim was explicit: to create Indians who were English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. Sadly, in the same year, the native medical institution was abolished, the Ayurvedic classes at the Sanskrit College discontinued, the Unani classes at the Calcutta Madrasa discontinued, and in their place, Calcutta Medical College was founded with one explicit mandate: students would be trained in strict accordance with the mode adopted in Europe through the medium of the English language. Medicine and language policy were legislated together in 1835. They have never been fully separated since. When we ask today why medical education in South Asia still happens in English, in communities where neither teacher nor patient speaks it fluently, this is where the decision was made. Coming now to the establishment of the Calcutta Medical College in 1835, 49 students were recruited by Lord William Bentinck, who was behind this college. And these students were aged between 14 to 20. They were exclusively trained in the English media, and anatomy classes started from day one. But here's the interesting part. When they passed, they were not called doctors, they were called native doctors, a title that placed them one formal step below their European counterparts in the professional hierarchy. Their starting pay, 30 rupees a month. The cost cutting logic was now beginning to work. The first dissection is an interesting story. Pandit Madhusudan Gupta was an Ayurvedic practitioner. He had been teaching at the Native Medical Institution, the one that Thomas Macaulay had just closed. And when the school closed down, he went and joined the new college, the Calcutta Medical College. On 10th January 1836, he performed the first human dissection in Asia. Now, remember, this was a time where no religion permitted or approved of dissecting a dead body. And this the as the rumors go, Dwarkanath Tagore, who was Rabindranath Tagore's great great grandfather, had a hand in smuggling in the cadaver for the first dissection. And what happened here was that Madhusudan Gupta faced excommunication from his community. And his response was that back to the ancient Sanskrit texts he had read as an Ayurvedic Vaidya and found passages that could be read as justifying the examination of the body after death. He used the language of one tradition to defend the imposition of another. The British, of course, publicized this event widely and published several accounts of it. It was an Indian body opened by Indian hands under European instruction. So this was touted as proof of colonial progress. Today, every time you dissect a specimen, every time you see a biopsy under a microscope, you're working within that epistemic tradition that Madhusudan Gupta, who holds a skull in his hand here, stepped into on that January morning in 1836. He was an Ayurvedic teacher standing in a colonial medical school. He had to give up something to enter that room. And I think about what that cost him and what it cost us, that none of us kept a record. So, who had access to this education? Have a look at this picture of the pioneers of medical education from Bengal. As you can evince from their regal robes, they were not poor, they were the wealthy and the privileged. Who had access to this education? Not women. Madras Medical College would not admit women until 1875, 40 years after its founding. Who had access to this education? Not practitioners of Ayurveda or Unani, who were now classified outside the legitimate system, not those who could read English and who could not read English, and not those who could not afford years of training for a government post at 30 rupees a month. The new medical education system was not designed for India's population. It was designed for the colonial enterprise because, and it selected preferentially those most useful to that enterprise. So the question of who gets to become a doctor, who is selected, on what criteria, in whose language, was answered in 1835. And sadly, we are still living with that answer. This is a timeline which shows the medical colleges which followed Calcutta Medical College. And we had Madras Medical College in 1835, the Grant Medical College in Bombay in 1843, the Colombo Medical School in 1870, the Dhaka Medical School in 1875, and several others. Notice what they had in common. Every one of them was English medium, anatomy centered, hospital based, and designed to produce graduates who would serve the colonial administration. And every one of them was built in a landscape where the vast majority of healthcare was still being delivered by the indigenous practitioners. The new system was actively delegitimizing the indigenous practitioners. Now, what was the impact on other systems of healing? Given the backdrop of colonialism and hegemony, the confluence of the East and the West was turbulent. It nevertheless transformed and shaped both the systems of medicine. Uh, what happened to the medicine that was practiced and refined for over 2,000 years? The short answer: these practitioners were not defeated by science, they were defeated by statute. So, have a look at this slide, which I call the clash of epistemologies. Look at the view of the disease. The Eastern indigenous traditions understood disease as pluralistic and holistic, what is called as the pathology of the soil. They looked at the patient's constitution, the environment, the social relationships. The Western colonial model was biologically reductive. It focused on what is called the pathology of the seed, on the specific pathogen, and the identifiable lesion. Now, both of these are partial truths, but the colonial medicine treated one as the whole truth and used that claim to invalidate the other. Look at self perception. Indigenous practitioners saw themselves as healers embedded in the cultural fabric of their communities. Colonial practitioners called themselves, and I'm quoting from historical record, Serafi Illuminati, which means the enlightened elite. That phrase tells you everything. A system that calls itself the enlightened elite has already decided that everything outside it is by definition unenlightened. And look at the primary focus. Indigenous systems emphasized health promotion and prevention, well being. Western colonial medicine focused on the curative, the intervention, the dramatic moment of treatment. And that distinction maps almost perfectly today onto the gap between public health and clinical medicine that we are still struggling to close today. Here are two images. On the left, you have the Ayurvedic man. And this particular image is from Nepal, from the tradition of Tibetan and Ayurvedic medicine. On the right, you have a picture you've seen before, Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, drawn in 1490. Both are attempts to understand the human body through a system of knowledge. Both are anatomically serious. Both are beautiful. The Ayurvedic tradition mapped the body through the lens of constitution, energy channels, and the relationship between the person and the cosmos. Da Vinci mapped the body through geometry and proportion, the body as a perfect mechanical object. And one of these, interestingly, became the foundation of modern medical education. The other became a wall hanging in wellness centers. Ask yourself, was that outcome inevitable, or was it a choice made by people with the power to make it? There was a paradigm shift, and that's perhaps too gentle a phrase, to what constituted legitimate medicine. How did the marginalization of indigenous medicine occur? It occurred through the policy of contempt. Western medicine was accorded the status of official medicine. Local knowledge, 2000 years of local knowledge, was labeled unscientific or irrational. What started as a clash of epistemologies, it was not a clash of competence. The indigenous practitioner was not less skilled, he was less powerful. And in colonial medicine, power decided what constituted knowledge. Secondly, marginalization happened through the legislative weapon. The Madras Medical Registration Act of 1914, read that date carefully, 1914. By that point, India had had Western medical colleges for nearly 80 years. And that means that indigenous systems had still survived. They had adapted, they had resisted, and they had continued to serve the population. So the colonial state did what colonial states do when cultural pressure fails. They reached for the law, a formal denial of registration. You cannot call yourself a doctor. You cannot practice in a government institution. You do not exist officially. The third is the class divide. For the colonizers, class exclusion was not enough. They used an ugly classification system. A class meant allopathic graduates. B class were the Ayurvedic graduates deemed, and I'm quoting for the historical record, not attuned to modern methods. Not attuned to modern methods. The practitioner trained in a 5,000-year-old system of pharmacology and constitutional medicine is B class. And a practitioner who has memorized the European anatomy in English for 4 years is labeled A class. The hierarchy was not scientific, it was administrative. It was designed not to describe reality, but to create it. And the legacy? This is the line I want you to read carefully. Indigenous practitioners who served 80% of the population were treated as untouchables of the profession. 80%. The vast majority of people on the subcontinent were being served by practitioners who had formerly been classified as inferior, as B class, as untouchables of a profession that existed in significant part because of the knowledge tradition they represented. This hierarchy persists today. This hierarchy persists today in our language, in our institutions, and in the quiet contempt that surfaces whenever an MBBS graduate is told that an Ayurvedic practitioner has been posted alongside them in a primary healthcare center. We did not inherit this hierarchy accidentally. We inherited it through a registry, through an act of parliament, through a classification system devised by devious people who needed the indigenous practitioner to be inferior in order for the colonial medical system to appear legitimate. This registry is old, but the stamp is still wet. So here we are. India became independent in 1947, Sri Lanka in 1948. The medical colleges did not close. The curriculum were not rewritten. The teachers trained in the colonial system trained the next generation, who trained the next and the next. Systems persist after political colonization ends. because they have become culturally internalized. After so many decades of independence, we still haven't been able to convincingly shrug off the colonial yoke. So, what did we inherit? And I want to name it, I would like to call it the colonial DNA. Because it replicates, because it expresses itself without our intending it to, because you can carry it without knowing that you have it and you express it. So, I'm going to talk about the 5 genes that we inherited from the colonial medical system. That those that we express often unconsciously in classrooms, in ward rounds, in examination halls across South Asia every single day. Gene 1, hierarchy. Gene 2, our obsession for cramming for examinations. Gene 3, English equals to power. Gene 4, treating the patient as a specimen. And gene 5, fragmentation. For each one, I want to tell you a story, a short story, and I think it will be familiar to you. And I want to show you where that story came from. So let's explore these 5 genes. Gene 1, hierarchy. Let's talk about the story first. A student is presenting a case on a ward round. Midway through, she notices something on the x ray which doesn't fit the consultant's diagnosis. She opens her mouth to say something, then she closes it. The round moves on. That x ray showed a lesion which the consultant had missed. Now the student has graduated. She has become a consultant, and her students still stand when she enters the room. So, what are the symptoms of this gene called hierarchy? Authoritarian teaching, humiliation during rounds, seniors whose judgment you cannot question, a culture of fear which is so normalized that we no longer call it fear, we call it respect. And where did this inheritance come from? The Indian Medical Service was a military organization. Its structure was the structure of an army. Rank, command, obedience, and the understanding that questioning a superior was not a difference of opinion, it was insubordination. That military hierarchy entered the medical college hospital in the 19th century. It has never left. We have simply renamed it clinical culture. I want you to reflect. Think of a moment in your own training when you knew that something was wrong, but you did not speak. What stopped you? And what did that silence cost? The pedagogy of deference is not a cultural inevitability. It is a specific inheritance from a system that was not designed for learning. It was a system designed for compliance. Think about it. Moving to gene 2, our obsession with cramming for examinations. Here is the story. It's 2 in the morning. At the hostel, a first year student is memorizing the branches of the brachial plexus, not understanding them, memorizing them. She has done this 3 times in 2 weeks and has forgotten it twice. Tomorrow, there is a viva. If she names the branches correctly, she passes. If she cannot, she will be humiliated. She will never be asked what she would do if a patient presented with a brachial plexus injury. That question doesn't come in the examination. Therefore, for her, it does not exist. So, what are the symptoms of inheriting this mutant gene? Rote learning, ranking anxiety, and valuing memory over meaning. Where did this inheritance come from? Remember, colonial medical education needed to mass produce obedient, standardized medical workers quickly. The terminal examination was the most efficient certification mechanism. It was never designed to measure clinical reasoning. It was designed to measure compliance with an approved body of knowledge. We produce exam survivors, not reflective practitioners, not critical thinkers. And then the exam survivors become examiners, and then they set the same examinations that were set for them. And this legacy continues. This one is for the faculty who are here. What is the last examination that you set that could not be passed by memorization alone, which needed the student to think critically or to reflect on their experience? If you're struggling to answer this question, you have your answer. Assessment rewards what we value. For nearly 2 centuries, we have valued recall over reasoning. We inherited that from a system that needed obedient subordinates, not critical thinkers. Gene 3, the concept that English equals power. Listen to the story. A student from a rural district tops her state board examination. She speaks 3 languages fluently, none of which is English. On the first day of her medical college, the professor begins speaking. She understands perhaps half of what is being said. She copies from the board without understanding. She memorizes without understanding the meaning. She qualifies. After 5 years, she returns to her village. A patient speaks to her in her mother tongue. She answers fluently, precisely, with care. She realizes it is the first time in 5 years that she has communicated in medicine. The symptoms of this mutant gene are that language is equated and treated as legitimacy. Fluency is confused with competence, and it comes at a double cost. It confers class privilege to the doctor who enters the profession and a patient disconnect for those who practice. This inheritance is direct and documented. Macaulay's 1835 minutes said, withhold grants from any institution conferring instruction in native languages. English was not chosen for pedagogical reasons. It was chosen to produce a class of people who were Indian in blood, but English in every other way. That directive was never reversed. Nearly 2 centuries later, we are still assessing doctors in a language that many of their patients will never speak. Think about it. How many of your students think in English? How many of your patients speak English? What fills that gap? And at whose expense? English serves as a gatekeeper, as a caste divide, and it's disguised as a standard. The standard serves the institution. And who pays for that gap? Unfortunately, the patient. Gene 4, treating the patient as a specimen. The story this time is about a patient and not a student. A woman from a village comes to a teaching hospital. She's 50 years old and has been referred for a breast lump. The consultant examines her. No curtain is drawn. 12 students crowd in. Nobody introduces themselves. The consultant demonstrates examination, speaking about the lump, its consistency, its mobility, all in English. The patient does not understand English. She stares at the ceiling. And when the students leave, no one tells her what they found. And she presumes that silence means everything's okay. It does not. What are the symptoms here? The patient is objectified. We speak of the patient, about the patient. We don't speak to the patient. How many times have you talked about somebody as that cirrhosis patient or bed number something, as if the patient doesn't have a name? Power symmetry in the colonial ward round is still fully intact. Where did this inheritance come from? Colonial hospitals were built on an explicit bargain. Poor patients received subsidized treatment in exchange for being available for clinical demonstration. They had no choice and no voice. That bargain was never formally ended. It simply became invisible, so routine that we stopped seeing it as a bargain at all. Foucault called this the clinical gaze. We did not invent it, we inherited it. But we express it every time we present a case, referring to the patient as the patient in as a grammatical object and never as a subject. Ask yourself how many times this patient used for demonstration comes from the private ward. Does it ever happen in your hospital? I want to ask the faculty, when did you last ask for patient's permission before bringing in a student? And when did you last teach a student to ask that question themselves? 8 seconds. That is how long taking that consent takes. It changes nothing about the clinical encounter. It only changes the relationship at the center. Gene 5, fragmentation. And here is the last story. Two doctors graduate from the same college in the same year. One completes a fellowship in interventional cardiology from a foreign country. He returns, performs hundreds of procedures annually. He's profiled in a journal. The other takes a posting in a district hospital. She manages complicated deliveries without the luxury of a blood bank. She diagnoses she diagnoses tuberculosis without a CT scan machine. She learns the local language patient by patient. These two meet at their 25th year reunion. The institute applauds the cardiologist. He features on the institute website. The rural doctor overhears her classmates refer to her as plain MBBS. She didn't do a post graduation. She overhears her friends say to a teacher. The symptoms of this inherited gene is that a person is reduced to a disease, community is reduced to statistics, and suffering is reduced to diagnosis. This colonial inheritance was designed for urban hospitals, serving colonial elites and the military personnel. The rural hospital, the rural population, the community, the primary health center, all of these were afterthoughts, and they remain afterthoughts. We train doctors in tertiary hospitals, and then we express surprise when they will not practice elsewhere. The deepest fragmentation happened when we separated curative from preventive, when we discriminated between specialists and community physicians, when we clapped for the urban over the rural, and when we called hospital medicine and the village posting. How many of your students want to become specialists? And how many want to work in a rural primary healthcare center? And what does that ratio tell you about what we are teaching them to value? The fragmented doctor is not a personal failure. It's a structural inheritance. But remember, the structural inheritances can be structurally reimagined, and it is high time we did that. Before we move forward, I want to give you a moment. We heard about 5 genes. You heard 5 stories, and I asked you to reflect on 5 questions. I want to ask you one more question, and this time I want you to write your answer in the chat. Think of one aspect of your own medical training that still feels colonial to you. Not a policy, not a system, something personal, something you have experienced in a classroom or a ward round or in an examination hall. I want you to write one sentence in the chat box. You don't need to explain it, just name it. I'm waiting. Yes, Kaushila. What would your Sri Lankan patient describe that elephant as?
So in Western text, they do describe chest pain as an elephant sitting on a chest. But having seen what an elephant is, a Sri Lankan would never say an elephant sitting on a chest.
Right. Yes, we still sadly use patients as specimens. Wearing aprons look colonial. Okay. What would you prefer, Victor? Yes. Yeah, we still call each other sir, ma'am. That's a vestige of the colonial times. Okay. You're right with it. Not everything was bad. But do you mean to say the rounds were very didactic? Yes. Okay. That's the sad part. We never carry out rounds as conversations. They're always firing squads. Oh, how you dress. That's interesting. Power dressing. This is true, Shiva, that 99% of the books that we read are written from in the West. All reference values are of Western populations. True. Yes. Thinking of it, yes. Everybody has a uniform. The military has a uniform, so we had a uniform too. Okay. So can we move ahead? Thank you so much for all your responses. Systems persist even after the political colonization ends because they become culturally internalized. We've stopped calling them colonial, we've started calling them standards. But here is what I want you to hold alongside that. Systems built by human decisions can be rebuilt by human decisions. The question is not whether change is possible. The question is what we do to preserve, what do we choose to preserve, and what do we choose to let go. And because decolonization is not the same as demolition, before we talk about what we must reimagine, let us be honest about what is worth keeping. So, what is worth preserving? Definitely the scientific rigor, the commitment to evidence, the um, understanding that clinical decisions carry life and death consequences and must be grounded in the best available knowledge. The public health infrastructure that colonial and post colonial governments built, the vaccination systems, vital statistics, epidemic surveillance, all of that, the advances in surgery and anesthesia, which came, and the foundational sciences, anatomy, physiology, pharmacology that allowed us to understand the body with precision. The tradition of medical education itself, the idea that medicine is a discipline that can be taught, assessed, and passed on. So, not all colonial inheritance is toxic. We must actively separate the scientific methodology from the oppressive pedagogy. What we are questioning is not the science. We are questioning the power structures that decided whose science counted, whose language was required, and whose patients could be used for demonstration, and whose healers were called second grade. The science and the power structure are not the same thing. We can keep one and we can reimagine the other. Coming to the last part, what must we reimagine? We've talked about 5 genes which we inherited. Now let's talk about 5 directions forward. For each of the 5 genes we inherited, I want to offer a reimagined word. It's not a solution, it's just a direction. So hierarchy can be reimagined as psychological safety. Move over with obsession with cramming for exam. It's time for reflective practice and critical thinking. English must no longer be equal to power. It needs to be reimagined as multilingual medicine. The patient can no longer be treated as a specimen. Each patient is a person to be treated with dignity, and fragmentation needs to be reimagined as integrated care. 5 words here. Each one is a different answer to the same question. What does it look like when we choose differently? Let's move to the first one, which is psychological safety. The colonial classroom was not designed for learning, it was designed for compliance. The professor was the colonial officer, the student was the so called native who must not question. If you look at Amy Edmondson's research, she says that high performing medical teams are not those where errors never happen. They are those where errors are reported, discussed, and learned from. Fear suppresses reporting. In a surgical unit, suppressed reporting kills patients. Psychological safety is not the same as being soft. It is the condition under which medicine becomes safe. So, what can we immediately do differently? We can create classrooms where it is okay to fail. It is okay both for the teacher and the student to say, I don't know. Maybe, as Vidit said, build ward rounds where a student can say, I see something different without the fear of um, what the response is going to be like. So it's important that we make failure the beginning of understanding, and failure is not the evidence of somebody being unworthy. The second point in this gene list, reflective practice and critical thinking. We have built a system that produces people with enormous clinical experience and almost no structured place to reflect on it. Remember the Dewey saying that we do not learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience. Um, we have forgotten that. What can we do differently? Replace some of the recall examinations with things like portfolios, reflections, some observed clinical encounters. Ask students, what did you learn from this patient? Instead of simply asking them, what is the diagnosis? And instead of that firing squad like ward round where students are bombarded, make case discussions conversations instead of judgment. I am from Bihar and I visited the ruins of Nalanda some years ago. And at the gate, among all the guides, I met this man, Kamla Singh, actually Dr. Kamla Singh. He had done a PhD on the history of Nalanda, and he loved it so much that after his retirement, he chose to become a guide, narrating the story of the magnificence of this university. And I was extremely exhilarated in the 3 or 4 hours that I spent there exploring the ruins of Nalanda, thanks to this one um, very knowledgeable guide. And when we reached, this is the picture of the residential quarters, which housed, um, you know, there were quarters like this which housed 10,000 students. I asked him, why do they look like this? And he told me to imagine what teaching looked like in the 5th century. Each student had a guru, a mentor, and they had one-to-one discussions, and then ample time for reflection and self-directed learning in their little cubicle-like rooms in this so-called residence or hostel. A few years later, I visited Oxford, and the guide there told me about their unique tutorial method. And I had this deja vu moment. I've seen this before, not in a British university, but in the foundations of an ancient Indian university in Nalanda. The tutorial method, the one to one relationship between a guru and a student, the personal mentorship, the learning that happens in conversation rather than in lecture hall of 200 was not invented in Oxford. It was practiced in Nalanda 1,500 years before Oxford existed. When the colonial system needed to produce medical workers at scale, it did what industrial mass production always does. It replaced craft with the assembly line production. The Gurukul, with its personal teacher student relationship, gave way to the lecture hall of 200, and the mentor became the broadcaster. If you go through literature, the teacher student ratio in Gurukul systems of Nalanda and Takshashila closely corresponds to what modern medical institutions now recommend. We had it, we abandoned it, and now we are rediscovering it and calling it innovation. It's time to bring back the concept of apprenticeship, not as nostalgia, but as evidence. The tutorial method works. We know it works because Oxford has never given it up. We know it because we invented it, because Nalanda existed 1,000 years before Oxford was founded. Look at these two images for a moment. On the right, the word medicine in English and radiating outward in different languages of the Indian subcontinent. This image is not a decorative gesture. It is a map of the distance between the language of medical education and the language of the patient. And on the left, this is one of our students from Sevagram sitting at the doorstep with an elderly man from his adopted village, um, from his adopted family. This is part of our community immersion program in Sevagram. This photograph is not a staged photograph. It was taken um, because it looked like something worth remembering by somebody who noticed it. What you're seeing in this photograph is actually multilingual medicine in practice. It's not a policy, it's not a curriculum objective. There's a student and this old lady here uh, in conversation at a doorstep in a language that they share. Um, this is what medicine looks like when it reaches the person it is meant to serve. What can we do differently? Allow clinical reasoning to be taught in the language the student thinks in, and then build the English bridge, not the other way around. I think it's important that you require graduates to demonstrate basic consultation competence in at least one regional language and teach students from day one that the patient's own words for their illness are clinical data, not noise to be translated into biomedical English. The word Ayurveda we talked about meant science of life, the whole life of a person. Ayurveda never forgot that the patient was a person. We did. We inherited the clinical gaze that sees the disease and renders the person who carries it secondary. Dignity and personhood asks us to reverse that, not as a soft aspiration, but as clinical practice. A person who feels seen will give you better history. A person who is heard is more likely to come back. So remember that personhood is not kindness, it is clinical intelligence. So, what can we do differently? Uh, for starters, ask a patient's permission before every student encounter, and definitely allow your students to watch you do this. Address patients by name in their own language. Always ask them if they want to know something about their disease, and teach the patient's narrative along with the clinical history. The last point, a village is not a punishment hosting. Every system we have built implies the opposite. The teaching hospital is the temple, and the primary health center is the dharamshala, the wayside shelter. We train hospital doctors for the temple, and then we wonder why they will not serve at the roadside. I want to tell you the story of the article that we published. And when we submitted our article for publication, one of the irate reviewers said that our paper was nonsense. Why? Simply because we dared to equate Ayurveda with modern medicine. What does that statement say about elitism? About the arrogance that we inherited? We are ourselves not willing to serve in the peripheral areas, and we look down on those who serve the really needy in our villages. We don't accord them respect. It is high time we recognized the Ayush practitioners as part of the primary health team. They need training, support, referral pathways, and our equal professional respect. They are not filling a gap we created. They are the primary health system for hundreds and millions of people. Our contempt for them is a luxury we cannot afford. So, what can you do differently? Begin community exposure in year one. Allow students to explore the social context before they start believing that the ICU is the only way of delivering medicine. And attach prestige to those who practice in the peripheral settings. Incentivize and reward real work, irrespective of where it happens. And here, in one table, um, I have summarized what we talked about: the five genes, the five symptoms, and the five reimaginings. If you want to take a picture, you can take a picture of this hierarchy, which produces a culture of fear, and it needs to be reimagined as psychological safety. We need to stop making our students cram for exams and push them towards reflective practice and clinical critical thinking. English is no longer the power language. It leads to patient disconnect. We need to think seriously about multilingual medicine. The patient is not a specimen to be objectified. Treat the patient with dignity. Um, and we have a fragmented healthcare system where we are pushing people to become urban specialists. And the answer to that is integrated care. This is the territory you will walk back into tomorrow morning. And I want to say something directly to this room because you are all interested in health humanities. You are health humanities educators, and in many of your institutions, you are told, sometimes explicitly, sometimes by the way, when budgets are allocated and when timetables are constructed, that what you do is supplementary. You are the soft sciences. You are the garnish on the real meal of medical education. And I want to suggest the extreme opposite. And I want to say it without qualification. Every reimagining I have done here, described here today, requires exactly the tools that health humanities provides. Psychological safety requires the ability to read power structures and name them. That is critical pedagogy. Reflective practice requires the capacity to sit with experience and make meaning from it. That is the humanities tradition. Multilingual medicine requires us to understand that language is never neutral. That is sociolinguistics and medical anthropology. Dignity and personhood require us to listen to illness narratives as something other than noise to be filtered into diagnosis. That is narrative medicine. Integrated care requires us to ask whose knowledge counts, whose suffering is visible, and whose community is legible to the system. That is medical history and health humanities. You are not on the margins of the project. Health humanities is the center, the core. In this diagram, health humanities is at the core, with each reimagining radiating from it. It is not a metaphor. It is the actual structure of this argument. And this network, the Global Network for Health Humanities, is a place where this kind of work happens across borders, across traditions, across colonial lines that still divide our medical institutions. Please do not let anyone diminish that work, including your own selves. Before I close, I want to give you a minute or two. I have an exercise for you. I want you to write a letter to your younger medical student self. I want you to think of the person you were on the first day of college when you were young, uncertain, full of something. That something could have been hope, that it could have been fear, it could have been both. Write down one sentence in the chat addressed to that younger medical student self. What is that one thing you would ask them to resist? what is that one thing you would ask them to preserve? And what is that one thing you would ask them to reimagine? I'm waiting for you. Just write one sentence in the chat. A letter to yourself. Thank you, Abhijit. That's interesting, Kaushika. Kaushila. Agree with you, Shilpa. And who's that before that? Supriya. Try and be more specific, and that'll make it more interesting. Yeah. Resist the need to teach peers in English. I like that. Yes, Dr. Saroj. The patients are our biggest teachers. Can we move ahead? Yes, Nandini. Thank you for being here. It's true. We don't know what we are imbibing from our seniors, and then unconsciously, subconsciously, we are doing the same thing. Yes, Harshu. Yeah, the examination methods, we need a complete reimagine there. Okay, let me move ahead. Resist hierarchy in the campus. I wish every institution said that. So both, yeah, senior, junior, and we make mistakes and nobody tells us. Okay, thank you so much. I saw something interesting there. Yeah. Preserve your curiosity. That's a valuable lesson. Okay. So let me wind up my talk with one or two slides here. What happened? So remember that every generation of teachers decides what deserves to be carried forward and what must be compassionately reimagined. And that is all I'm asking of you today. The colonial DNA is in the system, but the system is made up of people. And people, unlike genes, can choose. When I wrote that paper in 2016, I ended it with a quote from Mahatma Gandhi. And I want to end this session with the same words because in 10 years, I haven't found a better quotation. Gandhi said, I do not want my house to be walled in on all sides and my windows to be stuffed. I want the cultures of all the lands to be blown about my house as freely as possible. But I refuse to be blown off my feet by any. That is the position. Open to everything, rooted in something. We're not rejecting what came from the West, but we're talking about rootedness. And this is what reimagining the colonial DNA of medical education looks like. What will you do differently tomorrow? Not next year, not when the next curriculum committee meeting happens, not when policy is revised, tomorrow. What is that one thing that you will change tomorrow with one student or one patient? That is where reimagining begins, not in a document, but with a choice you take. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anshu. Mind-blowing. Absolutely fantastic. Any questions from the audience, please? Thank you so much. You've really changed the way we think, the way we look at the world, and the way we teach, the way we learn everything. Thank you.
Thank you so